I'm going to just talk about what are some observations I've had navigating the issues and problems being a Philam. I'm just pivoting the direction of my channel because I don't see a whole lot of Filipino content creators talking about these things. I don't know why. Probably because of what I'm going to talk about. Because I'm here now, I'm just trying to. I really want to understand what the culture is really like because I know my channel is all about understanding issues regarding Filipino culture. I thought that joining the Peace Corps and coming here to the actual country, it would help me understand what exactly is going on, and also kind of shifting the focus. So I just want to make that clear because I know my rambling just gets over people's heads sometimes, but not that many people often think about these things. Anyway, so I'm going to break these questions down into 3 parts. So first is going to be lighthearted. So what is your favorite Filipino food? I love sinigang. I love tinola, chicken tinola. I don't like eating chicken in my soup, but I do like chicken soup in general. So naturally, I love chicken tinola. So I do like rice, but I don't eat it every day. And it gets kind of annoying because at any point I don't eat rice. Some Filipinos just see it as strange, like, oh, you should learn to eat rice. And it's like, hello, I'm raised by Filipino parents. Of course I eat rice. I just don't eat it every day because, I have preferences like every other human being. I volunteer in the Bicol region, so I do enjoy kinilas. And I don't know if this is true. This is probably just like sensationalism, but people have been saying that kinilas is rated as the worst food of all time. Out of many other things. I'm sure that's not true. Maybe it's been highly criticized as not being the best soup, but worst food of all time? I don't think so. The person said, what sort of differences were most striking between Philam culture versus the mainland culture? I would say the obvious thing is that English is highly spoken between Philams compared to every immigrant group. And that's primarily because they have this mindset, even to this day, there's this mindset that their children has to be raised speaking English, because if they stick or even remotely try to adapt their native tongue, they have this fear that they wouldn't learn properly. Because during my medical preparation, going to Peace Corps, I actually made friends with another Philam, and his name is also Miguel, apparently. And we'd have this conversation while I was, taking vaccinations, like 3 different vaccinations. And I was asking him, like, yeah, what was it like, growing up Filipino American? And somehow our conversation got into how English is being perceived and how there is a no Filipino rule when interacting with other Philams. Like, you have to only speak English. Someone asked, this is in Spanish, she's asking about the culture shock. Like, what is, I don't know if it's like which or what is the biggest culture shock? It's actually quite a good question. I would say I can't really pinpoint a specific culture shock. So generally speaking, or categorically speaking, the biggest culture shock is the mindset, like how Filipinos think, how Filipinos interact with each other, and how they enact on their belief system is the biggest culture shock for me. Okay, next question. What great experiences you had as a volunteer? So I don't know if this great as in positive great or negative. I guess positive, yeah. Great experiences. I would say just hanging out and making new friends would be the greatest experiences I've had. Because it's a way for me to just shut my mind off. So that would just be it. Trying new food, discovering different desserts, learning about different food and their origins. Like, especially here, where I guess anywhere in the Philippines. I wouldn't have known these things if I had not been here. Yeah, just hanging out with locals and traveling, obviously. Next question. What aspects of your perception about the Philippines have changed since I started living here? They often describe Filipino culture as indirect. We have very indirect communication style. And now I disagree. I don't think we're entirely indirect. I think we're just different because there are some things that we are direct about that would be considered not politically correct or not appropriate in American culture, right? Like we can't just call someone fat or say things out loud, but here in the Philippines, we don't care. We don't because we don't care about context. We don't share like, oh, because of that we can't say this or that, unless of course it's like a professional setting. There's some things you can and cannot say depending on your job, obviously, but casually speaking amongst friends, we just say whatever, right? In the US or much of the Western world, we're much more a bit sensitive. We're much more specific and context based. And that's another thing that threw me off because they also describe this culture as context based. Now the language itself is contextual. Like we that's where the indirectness comes from. Like we say things depending on the context. But when we want to say things, we also ignore the context, right? Like you don't just because for Americans we want to understand that informs the way we communicate. With Filipinos, I don't think we care. People just say things without the understanding. That's I don't know if that makes sense, but that's basically what it is. So the aspect of hospitality. Okay, so for hospitality, the reason why I disagree with that now is because, I mean, of course there were instances where if I drop something in public and some random stranger would help out or like that's being hospitable. That's kind of them. I definitely don't get that a whole lot in the US. And so that I yeah that's a hospitable aspect of the culture, but I would not describe the entire culture as hospitable because there were also moments that when I'm clearly because now people are trying to address the toxic parts of Filipino culture, and that's why I don't think I would describe this culture as hospitable. I think we're just simply collective, and then we do these hospitable things because we just do them. That's just part of the cultural script. But we're not consciously hospitable, right? Like we don't choose to be hospitable. We just are hospitable because that is just how we're raised, but we're not conscious of it. And that's a very important distinction to make because coming here when I was being told that they are hospitable, I literally thought, oh, to the point where just people just give me money kind of a deal. I mean, when you think of hospitable, you think good graces, like things to make you like it's almost life changing, but that's not the case here. Just because you drop something, and because it would be like in Japan, right? Like you don't, you know, it's all formality, and I'm going to get into that. It's all formality. That's like a whole other thing I would get into, but anyway, I'm getting too riled up already. Do you believe that the Philippines as a society has developed more than what most Philams think? Well, that's that's an easy one. That's a big fat no, and I'll get into that later. What has been the easiest part about being Philam in the Philippines, and what has been hard? That's a pretty good question. This is by Anne, another Philam volunteer, and I would say the easiest part is blending in. I like. I will also get into this. I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a lot to unpack here. Her struggle. Correct me if I'm wrong, Anne. Her struggle has been the whole like dualistic, confusing identity, right? Like we're American, but we're also Filipino, and her struggle has been that she's always being mistaken for a local, and apparently that makes her a bit uncomfy. For me, I don't care. The hardest part is when they misunderstand me, and they make assumptions about me just because I'm American. Um, so it's interesting how Phil-Ams, we all collectively struggle with our identity, but the reasons being could be unique. Like I haven't talked to Anne in a long time, but from what I've heard, Anne wants to be seen as American, and like that's who she is because that's how she identifies as, and that's where she leans into. For me, it's not that I'm ashamed of being American, but I would rather be seen as the country that I'm ethnically from. Like I want to be among you guys, right? You also naturally um, people would value your opinions more, right? Because if you're seen as a foreigner mostly, then psychologically it's like, yeah, well, what do you know, right? Like what have right do you say talking about our culture? First couple of months were quite hard. Like I'm trying to understand how they perceive me, how they, you know, is my accent Filipino enough for them. And the hardest part though would be trying to address my observations that they themselves do not notice. Like they have this standard of perfecting English, and I'm trying to explain to them that their English is actually quite fine. You know, like there's no reason for them to be like super perfectionist. So I would say like their sense of perfectionism makes them critical of how authentic something is. So again, they just can't distinguish like foreigners who have adapted the language because of that amount of time and immersion versus someone like me who's only been here a couple months. Like I can't just perfect Tagalog that well. I mean, they would compare me to other foreigners who could speak Tagalog well, and it's like they don't see how that affects me as someone who literally grew up with Filipino parents, and here I am trying to harness my dedication to learning Tagalog, or people just tell me, "Oh, you're overthinking it." I'm not overthinking it. This is very apparent to us Philams, you know, not just for foreigners in general, but people like me. Where, okay, so you're going to congratulate, you know, a white American who could pronounce itlog well, but then when I'm trying to converse with you, that's not good enough. Like, you know, so that's been a difficult part is getting the locals to understand how difficult it is for me, who's actually gives a damn about this culture, right? Like I'm not just a typical tourist. I want to actually immerse myself and understand the deeper aspects, not just karaoke and drinking, you know, surface level things. The biggest difference that you feel is a barrier between Philams and natives. So this is like a two-part question. The biggest difference, I think I kind of went over it, right? Like for Philams, it's like this sense of liberal progressivism that for some reason natives don't quite understand why Philams find it hard to be overseas versus in the mainland, because you know locals tend to think, oh, you know, the greener grass on the other side, right? So much superior. It's more like we're being pitted against each other because of the politics and also the global economy, right? Because as you know, It just looks like it's better in America because you get paid more, but you have to also pay more, just like no different. So it's a class difference. They don't understand. We are actually suffering under the same conditions as you are. We're just on a different country with its own set of rules, right? But they're still tied. It's no different than there's another country that somehow hypothetically has a much better standard of living than the US. Guess what's going to happen? Now we're, it's the same thing. It's relative. It's not until they get to the US or into the other foreign country, now they realize, oh shit, we have to adjust the culture, the politics, the economy. So it's even beyond that. It's like they don't see how it's by design. There is a system that pits us against each other.
So, going back to this idea of form over substance, this sense of formality, I actually did a little bit of digging and see if there has been any initiatives in terms of trying to fix these problems. And it turns out there was this moral recovery program, and a lot of these things you will find are quite familiar. Number one being extreme family centeredness and extreme personalism, basically taking things too personal. We tend to be quite sensitive, in a deeper sense, cannot separate what is to be done from the emotional involvement. I don't think it's quite necessarily bad, but in the context of weakness of the Filipino character, there is the lack of discipline. No need to explain further. Also, the lack of initiative. We kind of wait around. We lack the sort of, like we're too patient for our own good. After being here for quite a while, I do sense this, like, we get fatalistic. We don't want to do something about it. We don't want to kind of like intervene and see, okay, how can we fix it? And going back to number three, the lack of discipline, there is this word palusot. Not sure if I pronounced that correctly. It's defined as impatience. So there is this sort of like contradictory, paradoxical aspect of our behavior because on one hand it says that we lack discipline, we are very impatient. At the same time, we're very passive. We're just kind of used to accepting the suffering of certain things when those things can be changed. Understandably, the city center, it's not very walkable. These places are underdeveloped, so there's not a whole lot of walking space. People just tend to be not very mindful of their space, so it's very easy to kind of run into people just not being aware of their surroundings, and so people tend to be in a deadlock or almost get into an accident. Of course, we have the colonial mentality. In a deeper sense, in the context of what I'm talking about, we have a lack of understanding of who we are. So this is goes beyond than just the lack of patriotism, but the lack of caring about where we want our culture to go, like where our direction is, right? I mean, you look at other countries like Japan or even Indonesia, India, they have a sense of who they are. It doesn't matter what their history is, it doesn't matter how many times they've been conquered or whatever excuse. Then we end up looking down at ourselves. But at the same time, we paradoxically like to gatekeep, but then we forget that we don't even know our own history that well. And we just kind of look up towards American culture and the cultures that we're so used to that we just automatically, without critical analysis or any deeper reason why we look up to Americans or Koreans or other countries. And so, ironically, if that's the case, why don't we learn from them? Oh, but no, that's not the Filipino way. Okay, well then what is Filipino? How are you going to defend yourself if you don't even know much about who you are, where you come from? So with chica, gossip culture, it really affects me heavily because my God, I can't tell you how many times much of the stress of has a lot to do with perception, which leads to the way I get treated and how, because I'm a representative of the US, and so reporting needs to be done and feedback will be given. And Chica can easily like kind of ruin your reputation in that sense, and unfortunately, this is one of the countries, one of the cultures in which Chica is a huge deal. Like almost slander, right? You talk shit about someone, and that could easily, if you're good at it, you could easily convince people, yeah, Miguel is just a terrible person. Don't listen to him. He's this, he's that. And it sucks, but that's the truth. That's how a lot of Filipinos are. But, on the bright side, a Filipino who is self-aware, probably the strongest proponent of getting rid of this. I'm not sure if this should be added on the list. A lot of you are familiar with utang na loob, the debt that you owe to someone. That's very big in Filipino culture. But I think that could easily be tied to extreme family centeredness. A lot of debt is often tied to family. But anyway, so lack of self analysis and self reflection. This can also be described as the lack of abstract thinking because self reflection it involves this idea that when you do something, you mean it. You don't just, okay, yeah, here and because you become a zombie in that sense, right? But just like exercise, just like studying or doing something over and over until you're good at it, the more you reflect a long time for years or even just a couple months, you get so good at it that it's not work. It's not stressful. It's not foreign, but to develop yourself as a human being. There's nothing wrong with form, but why? Or what is the point of this? Or what does this mean to you? And the other obvious example is the education system. At the school that I volunteer at, I was teaching a class in philosophy, and I chose to do that. I don't know what the case is with other education volunteers, but as long as it fulfills my mission as an American education volunteer. At first, I was excited. They have a class on philosophy. That's great, Content of what they're teaching is college level. Half the students in the class are not well equipped with English. They could understand some English, but they're too shy, and that's like another intersecting problem is the shyness in this culture. Like, they're not helpless, they're just so used to it, so they consciously just don't want to try out of embarrassment. It's really dumb. But in any case, so we teach these things, but we don't understanding of what it is that we are teaching. We just kind of go with the flow. I got that same frustration from the teacher, where the students, it's bad enough that half the class just doesn't understand and they don't see the value in it. I just focus on the few select students in one corner of the room while the rest of the students just kind of talk amongst themselves. It was a really awkward experience because the reality of what the teachers face. So I just focus on the few students who do listen because they're likely going to learn something because they care. So, yeah, anyway, this program was proposed, but unfortunately it was it tried they tried to implement it, but it wasn't fully approved for whatever reason, so it was just finished. They did not go through with it. And this was given by Leticia Ramos Shahani, a relative of another former president, and they come from a liberal background. So that just goes to show that you care. And because you care, you want to do something about it because it has to be addressed. And I also say this to show you that this is not some American neoliberal woke whatever intervention, right? This is our own people trying to do something about this country. And here we say we value education, but we don't value the process. And you don't have to take my word for it. You could see this all over social media, trying to address these toxic behaviors. Again, resiliency as a sign of strength, sacrifice as a sign of strength, dismissal of mental health concerns. In other words, being stoic. We don't stop to think, like, okay, how is this serving me? Or how does this help us move forward? We're so underdeveloped that we don't know how to deal with our mistakes, right? We have this idea of perfection, of like almost like an automaton, like things has to be done a certain way, and nothing else. Problem with that is if you don't allow yourself to make mistakes, or if you don't admit that, if you don't want to accept that, yeah, okay, this didn't work out, how do we move forward, right? So this is also to say that this is how the Philippines is behind internally. We haven't developed internally. To me, that is the most dangerous part. Not It's not about the socioeconomic conditions, but us as human beings. We haven't evolved. Is basically what I'm saying.
What conversations are you hearing about Philippine X? To be honest, not really. This is just purely online. The discourse itself is so messed up because the Philippines basically, we're just conservative all around, right? And that much of that conservatism, even to this day, right? Like this idea that self-reliance, making a lot of money, hyper religious on the Christian side. And so anything that's remotely woke is like, oh, Filipinx, they're taking away, they're changing our language. Well, Jose Rizal, by the way, he introduced the letter K. Well, not introduced the letter K, but the use of K in our written language. That's why you see a lot of K. We're still sometimes used to the letter C, but mostly K. They say that our language, the Philippine language, is contextual, but when it comes to understanding things, the context is suddenly like, you know, we're still being fed a lot of conservative, American conservative ideas when it comes to social issues. So that's why you don't really hear about it. And then when you do, it automatically gets shut down. I don't often hear it, but I know why. If Filipinx were accepted, it actually doesn't change much. Like, you can still say Filipino, you can say Pinoy, Pinay, Filipino, Filipina, Philippine, whatever. And then some people might choose to say Filipinx. That's all it is. Um, in fact, you don't even have to say it. It's just when you're trying to communicate something and you want to use an identifier that is inclusive, right? It's just like using the word people. You don't, instead of saying man and woman and children, you just say people. So Filipinx is basically operates the same way. It's ridiculous that I have to explain this, but that's the problem. And it stems back from the gap of the knowledge base, which results in a lot of misunderstanding. Have you ever felt like you don't belong in a place you're in right now? Okay, this is gearing towards the last set of questions. So this is tier 3. It's a bit more deeper. So have you ever felt like you don't belong in terms of like my journey here as a Peace Corps volunteer? Yeah, I did feel, I mean, I felt welcome, but at the same time, it's like the culture shock of Filipinos not being comfortable in discussing deeper issues. Only engage in certain topics that I know would be fair and easy to understand for them so that they could give me an appropriate answer that I wouldn't feel irritated by. I know what I'm doing is right, and it's just a matter of just sticking it out. What's the greatest demand as a person psychologically? Um, well, speaking of resiliency, that would be my answer. Um, Resiliency is such a buzzword, right? It's such a popular word. that they impart on us. Resiliency in itself is fine, but that's only half the battle. Is you're not leaving room for creative thinking. We have this phrase in Filipino. It's wala kang madiskarte, which mean because discarte is like resourcefulness, loosely translated as resourcefulness. So wala kang madiskarte is you have no, you lack creative thinking, you lack resiliency. It's basically saying you're lazy. And that's the problem in Filipino culture is we have these phrases that we don't realize are ideologically charged. It's not always our fault that we're lazy. And it's not that I'm helpless. It's just whenever I address issues at work that I'm trying to figure out how to solve these things or at least mitigate them, it gets really annoying when they say things like that. What do you hope to achieve in terms of personal reasons during your time here? So she's asking in the context of course, me working here. Right now, as a volunteer, I'm just learning. Okay, I'm just absorbing how I can improve in my teaching methods and just understanding the culture. Follow up question: are you getting there? I'm only getting halfway, but I'm confident that I will get there. How have you seen culture influence the acceptance of art in the Philippines? I think pretty much just like any other country where there is folk art, right? Like art that is already accepted, at least by the indigenous people. I actually did a video on this on my other channel that I did, I think, a year or two ago with my sister. From the 60s or the 70s, roughly up until the 90s, art has been addressing social issues. So it's like protest art, okay? Art trying to express the what's going on in society, a lot of social issues and politics. Because of that, art is in a bit of a weird stage right now. Luckily, from the 90s onwards, there was like a revitalization of comics because comics was actually quite popular in the Philippines. Now we have, of course, on Netflix, we have our first Filipino anime. Tresse was actually like a first ever major mainstream graphic novel, and now it's an anime, and we have like modern, our own graphic novels now, basically from the 60s to the early 90s. It's very localized, right? It's like specific to local problems. But now, because of the internet and being connected to the rest of the world, we have so many other foreign influences. Somehow, this is what's interesting in the Philippines is One Piece is very popular, and Voltus 5 is very popular. And then we have this sort of obscure, like 80s anime called Princess Sarah that also became a meme, and it was like huge in the Philippines for some reason, to the point where we have now Tagalog versions, like it's dubbed in Tagalog. Princess Sarah, Voltus 5, and a few other like 80s anime that was dubbed in Tagalog. To the point where now we have our own live action show of Voltus 5, but only in the Philippines. So we have Philippine actors speaking Tagalog in our adaptation of Voltus 5. Certain franchises have gotten so popular that we get to have our own adaptation, much like how the U.S. have their own live action American adaptation of anime now, not just Japan, but also the US and now the Philippines.
So, to answer the last question, what was something you were extremely disappointed in? Essentially, The most disappointing thing is just the overall this sense of dependency. And from personal experience, during a PTA meeting at the school, there were families who demanded that the student fee should be decreased. And I first thought to myself, okay, well, how many of these families have a lot of children? So I realized that every family at the meeting had at least three or more children, and yet they expect the school to accommodate every child for the price of one. So they just don't have that responsibility to decide and plan ahead of time, like how they're going to take care of themselves and afford that. This inevitably forces Filipinos to becoming a jack of all trades, right? To wear many hats when they can't even develop one quality skill through time and focus. I'm just super harsh because I care. I just expect the best, and but I'm not expecting a utopia. I'm just saying that we can do better. Basically, my vision for a better Philippine society, what it looks like, is just the same as usual, right? You walk down the street, everything's the same, but without the anxiety, without the lingering, this mediocre quality of things, and that things function better than usual. So, with all that said, my second part of the video will be going deeper and will involve guest interviews, guests who will give their testimony and knowledge. I recommend watching my video on laziness in preparation for the next part of this topic, and just increase my video speed to, I think, by 1.5 or something, as I may likely sound kind of sleepy. But anyways, thank you again for listening to my ramble. Gives you a bit of insight of what it's like to be a philam in the Philippines as a volunteer, and all my realizations and observations and all that jazz.